everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and thank you for your patience. This is the third panel of day one. My name is Şeyma Ekiz, and our topic is about a crucial crossroad of the EU, which is gaining strategic autonomy or reinforcing partnership in the Western Alliance. It is a highly relevant discussion topic at a time when international actors are establishing more flexible partnerships, showing signs of detachment from great power alliance, and also when they are resetting their priorities. So EU, as an influential international actor, is not an exclusion. EU feels deeply this necessity to reduce its dependencies, to increase its geo-economic resilience, while at the same time, EU and member states are in an endeavor to elevate their defense capacity to be able to respond to geopolitical threats. So, in very broad terms, strategic autonomy can be understood as an effort to rebalance EU's position in the global economic landscape, as well as building new defense alliances beyond the US. So investing more on a Europeanized defense industry, building an EU army, it doesn't necessarily have to replace national armies, but it might help overcoming this rapid reaction capability problem. And trade, in the face of Trump's administration's withdrawal from Europe, trade wars, Russian aggression, and so forth, so on. The EU has historically approached these challenges through liberal ideas of international order, but today the need for strategic autonomy has dominated the agenda. So our goal today is to discuss whether the EU will draw its own way apart from the US backing, or it will foster its partnership in the Western Alliance that has prevailed since 1940s. So I believe international organizations, this is something I have read somewhere, and I very much believe international organizations are just like humans and living organisms, so they have to make decisions, important decisions, about their goals, about which direction to go before they go into an existential crisis. So as Ian Menes says at a recent conference he attended in Brussels, it's like passing through the eye of the needle, and it requires a holistic approach. So today, I believe we can fulfill this approach, this responsibility, because we have guests not only as senior researchers, but at the same time, they have experience on the field through their interactions with politicians, with lawmakers and intelligence officials and bureaucrats, and at a professional level. So they might want to touch on their experiences in these areas whenever they see us fitting in. It seems, so we will be looking at the topic from various dimensions, as I have mentioned, although it seems like a black and white issue from the name of the panel. None of us has a black and white proposal, I guess, because we will try to bring more gray areas into light. This is what scientific approach promises us. So I don't want to keep it long, and I would like to start with introducing our guests first. So I'd like to welcome Professor Köse. He's here as the president of the Turkish National Intelligence Academy. And then joining him is Professor Bruckner so he serves as a EU Hegemony professor at Stanford in Berlin. And also we are happy to have Professor Lovatt. He's a senior policy fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program, European Council on Foreign Relations. And finally, we are welcoming Professor Akif Emre Öktem. He is a professor of international law at Galatasaray University. So let me start with the first question, and I would like to pose, so each of our speakers will have 15 minutes, and then we can have some time for questions from the audience. So Professor Bruckner, I would like to start with you, and I would like to begin with a broad question. In academia, here in Turkey as well, we largely rely on literature published by American and European scholars. So you have worked extensively across the EU, US, and China, and Russia, to the best of my knowledge. So this might have provided you with alternative visions of world order. So we need, so to say, your bird-eye view here, and please provide your critics of the prevailing Western-influenced production of academic knowledge, and please assess alternative narratives from non-Western parts of the world.
Thank you very much for having me at your university and such an interesting conference. Although I was introduced as someone who travels a lot and works in different capacities, this is something that differs from a lot of the things I'm doing, because I sit here with a steep learning curve and meet people I usually wouldn't meet. So thank you very much for having me here. And having said this, as perfectly Western as I am, as a German who's based in Berlin, working for an American university and working for the German government in their diplomatic academy, I saw from the previous panel that there are many more people who are much better qualified than me to talk about a non-Western perspective and what the Western perspective actually implies, because I'm a product of the Cold War. And as old as I became with working on European integration for 40 years, it's difficult to change what I or my generation consider the natural order of things. And if I receive a question like the one I got here in the media, it often starts with, don't you think we need a different way of looking at conflicts or at opportunities or something? And then it's not so much a question of my analysis or what I observe from a bird's eye perspective, but it is much more an asking me for confirmation of something that the moderator or the interviewer wants me to confirm. But as I said, this is not what I do most of the time, and I'm actually happy that I'm a product of a Western environment, of what was also questioned before, of knowledge production, because I think knowledge doesn't have a nationality, or it is not Western or Eastern or whatever per se. But of course it is highly political what questions we ask and under what conditions we do this. And I attended a number of governmental events in this country where statements were made like, we live at the end of the liberal era. And it sounded like a good thing because the world is more than 5 and we are very unfairly distributing opportunities, and what we discussed before, the different infrastructure investments are not neutral or perfectly economic, but they also distribute opportunities. And if we take this into consideration, then access to opportunities and how fair we distribute different resources has a lot to do with through what lens we look at what we discussed in the previous sessions or what we discuss here. So the reason why I'm happy that I am a product of the Western world and that I would try my best to postpone the end of the liberal era a little further is that in my understanding, it's not a hegemonic concept per se, because as we heard before in the discussion, everything has different dimensions and we can wear different glasses to look at the same thing. So nothing is just one-dimensional. But the good thing and why I am so committed to it has to do with the fact that I have the privilege to work in academia, as most of us do, and I can do this in an environment in which I can say whatever I want. and I'm not punished for this. And now, given the fact that I don't need a career anymore, I can even more so say whatever I want. And I think this is a very crucial difference compared with environments in which I would strongly agree that their knowledge production or their historical and cultural luggage that they use to look at things differently and develop non-binary concepts, as we discussed in the panel before, that this is something that can make a major contribution to find better solutions than the solutions that are apparently dysfunctional from a Western standpoint. And what the liberal script has done to the world and to environment is not something to be utterly proud of. But when it boils down to what we do in academia, then my personal freedom and the idea of human rights that are guaranteed because there is an assumption that there is a state that could restrict my personal freedom rights. This crucial element of what we do in academia, this is at many parts in the world at risk, and therefore I'm happy that I don't need to think about it. That I can happily, like last Friday, be on a panel with a German diplomat and a German member of the governing party in Germany who currently serves in the European Parliament, and on stage criticize the German government for its dysfunctional migration policy. Because what we heard before about Pakistan and India, that there are problems because of how we address borders, is something my grandfather experienced as a German compared with neighbors in France. And the consequence from this endless war between Germany and France, because we are designed as eternal enemies, this was addressed in a different way by interdependence brought to us by the European integration project, in which we overcome internal borders, and now people couldn't care less if something is Alsace or a Saarland or whatever border regions were a major cause of war in the relationship between Germany and France. So it is a matter of concepts, and it has a lot to do with the language we use and how we talk about things, but it's not impossible to overcome, as we show in this form of multilateralism in the European Union that simply managed to stop us from killing each other for the last 80 years, which is the longest phase of peace for the countries involved in the project, which is partly a problem for the ones who are in, because they were so blown away by the beauty of the concept of interdependence that they forgot that there are other concepts that still use war as an option and would be willing and able to start a regional conflict like Russia invading Ukraine, and then we stand there basically unprepared and don't know what to do with this new situation. And this is the drama of the last, as we heard before, sometimes decades don't feel like decades, and sometimes weeks feel like decades. We are now in times in which things change so quickly and so massively that we try to address a lot of things, not only academically to address them and analytically grip what is going on, but also to prepare politically. And this is a big challenge for an aging society, because what I said about myself, that it's difficult to think outside of the box and question core assumptions that were valid until they were not. This is even more difficult for politicians to communicate to their public, that we have to set different priorities. We saw this when climate change moved up to the priority list in 2019, when the European Parliament elections were won because of all the parties that highlighted that this is a top priority, because it's not about us, it's about the living conditions of the human species on the planet. And now it's getting lower because everything is securitized. And we saw this in the discussion about the Belt and Road Initiative that we discussed before, and we see this in trade relations, in which dual-use components should be addressed in de-risking strategies to make us less vulnerable. but it doesn't go as far as the title of our panel, because as previous speakers mentioned, things aren't black and white. And so I personally see that we struggle a lot with defining our relationship with the United States of America that has always been seen as a core pillar of, for example, German foreign policy. And now we don't know if we are worth being defended, according to Vice President Vance, who came to Munich to tell us that we are far too liberal and we moved away from what NATO in essence is as a value-based organization. So we don't know if NATO is as brain dead as President Macron said a few years ago, Professor and it exists Bruckner as an institution, or if we are still able to be defended. I see I overstretched my limited time, and there is another question.
So let me move forward with the second question, if you allow me. So you have delivered training to international diplomats, to German diplomats, and may I ask you, how do international diplomats view the EU's role in security and defense? How do professional foreign policy practitioners conceptualize Europe and its role in the world?
What I said as an answer to my first question was already slowly moving towards the other one. That, of course, depends on what diplomat we are talking about, because diplomats are usually not the ones who think outside of the box. What I praised as the academic freedom that we enjoy if we can bite the hand that feeds us, this is totally different in the perspective of diplomats. So diplomats should formulate a sentence that another diplomat could finish, because they present the official position of the government. That's their job description, and not to think of, and what if, or can we question certain hypotheses. But of course, as we know, reality is not only what we measure, reality is also how we talk about things, as previous panels underlined, and therefore the perception of how we are seen or how we want to be seen is as crucial as what is happening on the ground, or how many tanks can we count, or what is our security strategy, or whatever else is counted as the reality that is empirically possible to measure. So the European Union, as I see it, whenever I travel to the European Commission or talk with people in leading positions, doesn't see itself as a great power. It sees itself as something that is losing importance, because not that we don't know what to do, but the rest of the world is growing. And that needs a repositioning. This is a very important element, and it affects across the board the different horizontal competences that the European Union shares. On top of it, we are aging and shrinking, so we urgently need immigration to fill our labor market shortages, and this is something that directly affects the work of diplomats who reach out in other parts of the world, or who represent the different interests that have to do with immigration, both within the European Union, that we have brain drain problems in the periphery, but also going to parts of the world to recruit the next generation of IT specialists or people who work in our health system. There is a growing appetite for the best brains and certain qualifications that we are not producing domestically, so to speak. So this is a game changer compared with what we discussed before about the situation of our labor market. But another game changer is, and that continues with what I just said about we don't know what NATO means in the nearer future, because we don't know how the United States positions itself in this part of the world, or whether they want to get rid of the North Atlantic part of NATO and rather want to globalize it, because the Asian theater seems to matter much more to the current American administration. So there are a lot of changes that directly and indirectly affect us, and therefore, if we don't manage to prepare ourselves, we end up being simply condition takers. And this is happening at a time in which are so many internal problems and international problems asking the European Union to do something proactively. And now we spend tons of money on remilitarizing a space that was proudly presenting itself as a civic organization, and now we militarize. To what extent and for how long, and whether this has to do with a threat perception in our direct environment remains to be seen, but our new government in Germany, and that was immediately echoed by the European Commission President, who also happens to be German, is that we spend on a European and on a German level tons of money, which will be underlined next week at the NATO summit, which is in fact a zero-sum game, because the money that we spend on defense cannot be spent on the pressing problems of addressing climate change and a fairer distribution of opportunities in the global majority or global south, or whatever term you prefer to use.
Last words, please.
And therefore, no one can really predict in what direction we are heading if we see this priority shift. Thank you,
Professor Bruckner, for your interesting highlights, including knowledge production doesn't have a nationality, something to discuss further, but we can do it another time. So I would like to move forward with Professor Köse, and I would kindly ask him to share his thoughts. So, Professor Köse, the European Union itself is a complex entity with its supranational structure and also having state-like characteristics. On top of it, the EU is confronted with military and hybrid threats. Based on your scholarly research and your insights from the Turkish intelligence establishment, within the broader discussion of great power competition, how would you position the EU within the international system, given its declining relation with the US and its military and economic capacity?
Thank you very much. It's good to be back here. So I studied undergraduate, and this room was one of the rooms that I get my intro classes. So I think one of the discussions that is relevant for both Turkey and EU is the notion of strategic autonomy. I think right now, calibrated discussion on strategic autonomy is very significant. I mean, it has been discussed. It has been on the agenda of European countries for a while. But I think it is right now the right time to discuss it in a more, specific way. So I think, what do you mean by strategic autonomy? I mean, states' capacity to define and pursue its national interests independently within the global system. So, yes, I mean, one of the key components of Europe was a part of transatlantic alliance. So it has different components. So at the military level, definitely NATO was the central pillar of this transatlantic relationship. On the other hand, there's financial pillar. There is also EU pillar, which focuses on institutions, norms, and values. And also, it also organizes the domestic politics. So what happened is that, European Union has been under the umbrella of United States for a long time under the NATO. So, and this provided them to increase their wealth, increase stability, and cooperate in many fields, and have been successful in many areas, including economy, including foreign policy, and also providing wealth to their citizens and avoiding conflicts, and producing an infrastructure, producing technology. So it was very competitive. However, I think this consensus was also based on international institutions, multilateral institutions, as well as the financial institutions. And I think this umbrella worked successful for a long time. We have to give credit to this. And for a long time, it worked. But when we go back to the fundamental pillars of this system, there was I think one key idea was having a joint threat perception. So at that time, Soviets was a general overall threat, and joint threat perception was very important. And for another thing, joint understanding of ideology, liberal democracy, as well as worldview, and also joint understanding of international economy, which was institutionalized in IMF, World Bank. Yeah. So this unity was institutionalized in such a framework that it worked very well for a long time, provided security, peace, and stability and predictability for both Europe and US. What happens right now is, I think, the fundamental pillars of this stability has been shifting. I mean, the priority, I think the key idea of threat perception is not same for Europe and US anymore. So after the 9/11 events, the hybrid threats become priority for US. Yes, it affected Europe as well, but it did not resonate in the same way. So Europe rather focused more on environmental threats and other threats, and they developed important capabilities to deal with those threats, whereas US was dealing with the more hybrid threats, terrorism and other things. And right now, we are moving to, after the 2008 economic crisis, economic problems become much more relevant. And we have to also understand that under these stability that is provided by US military umbrella with the NATO alliance, both China and Europe benefited a lot with the trade with US. So in cumulative, starting from 2000s, I think Europe has a trade deficit around $3.5 trillion for US. And for China, I think it is even more, $4.5 trillion trade, positive trade deficit, trade surplus with US. So I think when we look at the transatlantic alliance, they felt, I mean, US right now has different threat definition. Right now, they see their economic deficit as a problem. So when we go back to the discussion of strategic autonomy, Europeans right now have a different priorities in their defense and in their threat perceptions. So I think we have to redefine, and it will not overlap in the coming years. So the threat perception of Europe and US will not overlap. I mean, as Turkey, we already experienced in this problem starting from 2000s. So for Turkey, strategic autonomy was a necessity, not a choice, because we had been dealing with the hybrid threats, terrorism, and other issues starting from the 2000s. And unfortunately, NATO and our Western allies did not really help to deal with these problems for a long time. So if you go back to, I think the notion of strategic autonomy has been discussed much earlier in Turkey because of all these issues. So we started the strategic autonomy debate starting from 1990s, but the real debate was more after Sarkozy and Merkel's policies to sideline Turkey in EU integration. So it was after 2007 when strategic autonomy became central pillar of Turkey's foreign policy. And this also affected a lot after 2014-15 when Turkey was also sidelined in its struggle in Syria. So once Turkey was threatened by Assad regime with chemical weapons, our allies Germany and Netherlands decided to withdraw their patriots because these can be used against the PKK. So these 2007 and 2015 events also strengthened our notion of strategic autonomy. So what do we mean by strategic autonomy? I think strategic autonomy is not an isolationism. I think it's not an outcome. It's rather a mindset. So it is the mindset. I mean, we already experienced in 1970s when Turkey was also dealing with the Cyprus issue. So it flourished, although we were part of the NATO, starting from 1960s and 70s, this strategic autonomy idea has been seeded in 1960s, 70s. So this mindset has been developed. So at that time, Turkey decided to have autonomous military capacity, military technology. And also, this investment has continued in 2000s. And strategic autonomy is at the same time a process rather than an outcome. And it also does not mean an autarky and isolationism. I think we also have to understand. You can increase capacity of your strategic autonomy while you continue your alliances. So that's how it worked for Turkey. And also, it is a relative term rather than absolute. So I think right now, in 1970s, early 2000s, and after 2014-15, Turkey has experienced necessity, episodes to emphasize strategic autonomy and try to keep up with this. For Europe, I think it started after the 2008 economic crisis, and it actually increased after the President Trump's re-election. And I think this will continue in the agenda of EU for a longer time. I think there are lots of lessons from Turkish experience of discussion and how try to keep up with strategic autonomy. And also this strategic autonomy debates in Europe may also overlap with Turkey, and we can also, this does not necessarily prevent cooperation in that area. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Can you hear my voice?
No.
Can someone, okay. So one of the conclusions that I draw from your presentation is that the period that Turkey is seeking for strategic autonomy and the EU's seeking for strategic autonomy is overlapping, and we can see this the signs of this overlap in deep engagement of Turkey and EU member states, especially in defense alliances. So you have like 5 minutes. If you can limit your answer to 5 minutes for the second question, I would be happy. As a researcher whose academic trajectory has focused extensively on conflict resolution, how do you assess the rise of far-right parties in Europe and the implication of this ideological shift in Europe or in the neighborhood?
I think it's a significant challenge for EU and transatlantic alliance because it was based on liberal democracy as a fundamental ideological principle, which was institutionalized certain mechanisms. So I think this is a significant challenge because it is the cement of ideological orientation and institutions. So far right rather focuses more on national interests and does not want to focus on institutions and also multilateral mechanisms that can handle the conflicts in a different way. So for us, I mean, for Turkey, I think we have been experiencing the far right much earlier. So the far right responses was, I mean, we were the outsider, as a Muslim country, a majority Muslim country, we experienced the far-right discourse much earlier. So Sarkozy, Merkel, although they were liberal in their internal affairs and internal European affairs, their discourse towards Turkey was close to far-right discourse. So they are quite exclusionary to the Muslim majority country. They are quite exclusionary to migration, Turkish migrants. So I think we already felt this. That's why we try to find our path towards strategic autonomy and try to increase our relationships. So I think for Europe, this is a challenge. I think for us as a Turkey, we experience both liberal arrogance and hubris, and we will feel the similar far-right, hubris and far-right arrogance. So there will not be a much change for Turkey and maybe other countries. But for internal debates in Europe, I think without this cement, I think the relations in Europe, especially concerning the security and some of the economic policies, will be much more transactional, much more selective-based, and the governmental change will also have a significant impact on policy choices on EU. So there may be some advantages as well as disadvantages. So, but Europe needs to adapt itself to this new reality. In the past, in the regular time, when liberal democracy and liberal institutions were functioning in a much more effective way, almost the policies were quite predictable. So economic policies, domestic policies were predictable, and the governments have already outlines for their policies in the labor, in environment, everything. So it was much easy era. So right now, the governments will have different policy choices which will not overlap with the Brussels preferences. So it will be much more difficult, but at the same time, this may allow them to act more pragmatic and selective-based. So I don't also see this as a significant threat to relations with Turkey and US, because there may be some overlapping areas which, with a less ideological and more pragmatic orientation, which may allow for... I
have to intervene here, Professor Köse. Let's not expand it to Turkey and US, and we can do it another time on another day. So as one of our panelists have mentioned, when far right occupies more than half, it's not marginal anymore. So I think what we have to do is to design some political strategies to avoid this type of fragmentation. So I would like to real quick move forward with Professor Lovatt. And here is his question. While the EU stands firmly in solidarity with Ukraine and accuses Russia of genocidal intentions, it simultaneously offers support to Israel, which is, in your own words, Professor Lovatt, new destabilizer-in-chief in the Middle East. So my question is, only recently European capitals started to question the future of arms sales, and they have started to discuss to recognize Palestinian statehood. So how do you evaluate EU's reactions to Russia and Israel, reflecting on the balance between normative and pragmatic objectives beyond this issue of double standards?
So, it's a bit loud, isn't it? You certainly don't need me to talk to you and explain European double standards and hypocrisy and so on and so forth. I think it's quite obvious to most of us. Perhaps what I can do by way of a segue into answering your question is just to pick up on the strategic autonomy, and then and I think how that then plays out, or doesn't actually, when it comes to the Middle East. And I think the issue with strategic autonomy from the European perspective is it's more conceptual than practical. And for it to be actually become practical, Europe needs to get over its reliance on the US. Now, one would imagine that is why this concept of strategic autonomy was invented, in part in response to the first Trump administration. But I think cognitively, instinctively, emotionally, Europe has never been able to move beyond the US. And I think probably a few of us could make a good argument for why that is important. But nevertheless, Europe has not been able to do it, even when, in its view, its core strategic security interests are on the line in Ukraine. And from a European position, what happens in Ukraine more directly impacts Europe. And I think that is something that I agree with, and I think is quite obvious given the geographic proximity. It doesn't mean what happens in the Middle East doesn't impact Europe, but certainly there is a more direct and a close threat posed by the future of Ukraine, its potential collapse and Russian victory. But even there, when the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, was withdrawing its military support, was threatening the government in Kyiv, Europe could still not step up fully. Yes, there's a lot of activity. Europe has sort of reimagined now strategic autonomy as actually an initiative to rearm Europe. And so that's, I think, how it's mostly playing out, is this idea that Europe needs to be able to develop its own kind of indigenous domestic arms production capability to be able to step in where the US steps out. But even here, it's still very much a work in progress. This leads me to the Middle East. Because Europe has not been able to wean itself off the US, to move beyond its dependence on the US, it also needs to be careful when it picks fights with Washington and where it picks fights with Washington. So from a European perspective, if Ukraine is the most direct threat, or I should say Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the most direct threat to its interess, then European capitals will be much less likely to go against Washington's policies when it comes to other areas of the Middle East, and none more so when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So this is in part preventing Europe from actually being able to articulate its own independent policy when it comes to Israel-Palestine and to Gaza, and to now Israel's attack on Iran. But I would also very much argue that Europe's inability, in my view, to step up and to challenge Israeli aggression in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and Iran, it's not just because of the transatlantic relationship with Washington. It's not just because Europe doesn't want to go against Washington, or at least too forcefully against Washington. I think it really is also, despite the criticism of Israeli policy that I'll come to in a second, this support for Israel is still deeply hardwired into the perceptions and views of the European policy elite. And I think there's still very much a desire to differentiate between what Netanyahu or the Netanyahu government is seen to be doing and Israel, to say we are against the Netanyahu government, but we are still very much for Israel. So we can't blame the US for everything. I think this is also about how Europe actually reflects upon itself. And I think what is quite amazing is if you had a purely a geopolitical-based, rational assessment of what Europe should be doing in the Middle East, then the answer would quite clearly be oppose Israeli aggression across the board, Israeli actions which are actually directly undermining, threatening European interests. And I'm not just talking about Europeans' self-declared goal for a two-state solution, nor even the international liberal order, but Israeli actions are generating renewed conflict, renewed instability in the Middle East. That is in turn risking reigniting terrorist threats, reigniting uncontrolled migration, undermining important economic linkages between not just the Middle East and Europe, but the economic linkages that pass through the Middle East. And this is not to say that Israel has been the only bad actor in the region historically, but at this moment in time, with a regionally weakened Iran, with a Hezbollah that has been severely degraded, with Hamas where it is in Gaza, it is clearly Israel that is the one that is now reigniting conflict. So from a purely rational, geopolitical, interest-based point of view, hardwired ideological support, and that desire to keep Washington on side. What I would also add is, this is clearly undermining European standing in the Middle East and in the non-Western world. And I think anyone who speaks to you, who speaks to non-Western audiences, quite clearly sees that. That means an erosion, at the very least, of European soft power. I would argue also European economic and business activity in the Middle East in terms of boycotting of European companies. But it also means that when European governments do say something, no one really listens to what they have to say or takes them seriously. And so when when European leaders go to Arab capitals and ask them for support on Ukraine, the response is, well, why should we support you on Ukraine when you've done nothing to support the Palestinians? Why should we support you on Ukraine when you have not responded in the same way against Israel's annexation, occupation of Palestinian territory as you have against Russian occupation, annexation of Ukrainian territory? And this was already the case before the current Gaza war. So by continuing, I think, our blind support for Israel, we are also undermining our own regional standing and our own ability to be a geopolitical actor, which is what the EU has long wanted to do. And I think the test of our geopolitical ambitions is not what we do in Ukraine, although that does matter. Ultimately, I think the test of our geopolitical ambitions is Gaza, and is whether we are seen to be actually stepping up to be a political actor that can actually impose and defend the international rules-based order from the actions of friend and foes alike. And a final point on this idea of I guess, a Western or European liberal international order. Speaking to a lot of non-Western interlocutors and Arab officials in particular, there is a sense that this liberal international order is not only over, but was always a false promise. And I think and it's seen as something that Europe has long preached to other capitals, to other countries, but itself never actually been that serious about when it seemed to be going against European allies. And I think this is ultimately the biggest consequence. If the international rules-based order collapses, it's not just because of the actions of Russia or China. I think it's in large part because Europe itself and because the US, which built this international order, are not actually being seen to be defending and living up to it. So ultimately, this is a huge moment for Europe and a huge moment of truth, whether it will act. And I didn't answer your question about the sanctions, but this is obviously a very real conversation that was happening in European capitals, where there was this shift amongst governments against Israeli action in Gaza very belatedly. But then Israel attacked Iran, and I think that's quite remarkable what happened afterwards. Israel was quite clearly the aggressor. There was there were negotiations underway between the US and Iran to resolve the nuclear program, to reinstitute a nuclear agreement that the US had itself abrogated under the first Trump administration. So Israel took this action that was unjustified, basically declared war against Iran, and Europeans blamed Iran and supported Israel's right to self-defense. But also what happened, and I will really finish on this point, is what criticism there was of Israel and the Israeli government and this talk of sanctions against Israel because of its actions in Gaza and the West Bank, that's now, I think, broadly been sidelined. And European elites have reverted to their instinctive support for Israel and reverted now to championing Israel even at the risk of their own geopolitical interests.
Yes, Professor Lovatt, thank you for your answer. I very much understand your hardship in trying to limit your answers in 15 minutes, as there is no simple solutions, simple answers to these questions. But in accordance with the format, I have to move on with the second question, which is a follow-up question echoing a question that I have asked to other panelists. I know you have collaborated with numerous European parliamentarians and decision makers. Drawing on your interactions, how would you analyze the EU's recent role in the world, which has moved away from transatlantic cooperation? And if relevant, could you also talk about how journalists, think tanks, or lobbying groups have affected this position of the EU?
On the transatlantic relations, I don't think the EU or Europe has moved away from that. And in some ways, I think the relations with the second Trump administration are far better than relations with the first Trump administration. Again, despite all this talk of strategic autonomy, despite all the criticism from European leaders of Trump, Trump while he was out of office, European leaders are making different calculations because, again, I think so much of it is driven by the perceived need to keep the Americans on side to support Ukraine. For countries like the United Kingdom, I think the transatlantic relation is also seen as something that is sacred and is worth defending, and also as a means of strengthening the UK's hand when it comes to the EU, and as sort of a UK value added. But certainly, I think in all these key European capitals, keeping the US on side is important. And I would say, just a parenthesis, there was something that I don't think anyone's talked about yet. There was supposed to be a UN conference held in New York. It would have been actually today, co-hosted by Saudi Arabia and France. And I think that in itself was a very important, or could have been a very important illustration of the importance of tightening cooperation between European countries, the EU, and Middle Eastern countries, Turkey and Arab countries, to be able to pursue common interests, whether in Syria or Gaza or elsewhere. And before the conference, it was quite clear that, yet again, what Europe could deliver in New York this week would also be seen as a test of its credibility. So Saudi Arabia and a lot of other countries were eagerly anticipating whether France would recognize Palestine. And that was seen as, we can argue how much that changes on the ground, but it was certainly seen again as this sort of litmus test, as the test of European credibility to deliver something. And whether France would have done it or not had this gone ahead, as someone who's speaking very, very often to European officials, I don't think anyone knew. And potentially if France had not recognized Palestine, it would have been because, of a very aggressive Israeli pushback, and because the Trump administration was demarching France and other countries against the conference and making clear that the US did not want to see France recognize Palestine. So if it had not done that, again, that would illustrate the importance of keeping the Americans aside, and also the difficulty of going too much against Israel. Maybe I have 2 minutes left. In terms of how, interactions with, civil society interactions, let's say, with European governments, because it's not just think tanks or analysts. I mean, Europe is a very vibrant civil society, or has a very, very vibrant civil society, and I think there's always a competition for attention of European policymakers. However, I think the issue is, you have these huge bureaucracies and foreign ministries and stuff. Ultimately, it's one individual who will make a decision in each country. So despite all this engagement in France by civil society, ultimately it's the president who will make a decision whether to recognize Palestine or not. The same thing in London. And so ultimately, I think there is a question about, this is, I feel sorry to say, given the diplomats and people who work with those institutions, but ultimately, how much do foreign ministries actually matter when power is increasingly concentrated in, the president's office, the prime minister's office? And I think there is, clearly institutional challenges, but also when it comes to civil society engagement, I think that's a challenge. Last point, though, what I haven't talked about are European publics. And I think there has been a huge shift against Israel, and something that is really dramatic, and I think represents a real breakage. And that will continue to shift because of what Israel is doing in Iran. And that public pressure, I think, will be the ultimate driver, and is already the ultimate driver of the limited changing positions of European governments. If they're changing their position very slowly, it is because they have to deal with increasingly angry European publics who are increasingly angry, not just at what Israel is doing in Gaza, but the perceived support and collusion of their governments with that.
Thank you, Mr. Lovatt. And next, we are very happy to have Professor Öktem, and he will talk about an issue that has received limited attention, at least in my capacity. So he will be talking about the church structure and their role in geopolitics. So my question to Professor Öktem is, what role has the Ukrainian Church's declaration of autocephaly played in the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine? And I'd like you to please start with defining what autocephaly means.
First of all, if you allow me to do so, I will like to thank you for your kind invitation. It happens that my wife is a professor at Bosphorus University. I often come for lunch or coffee with her, but I seldom come for serious scientific activities, so thank you so much for this, giving me this opportunity. Well, autocephaly I'm not well placed as a Muslim to speak about church law, but in church law, autocephaly means independence, ecclesiastical independence. It comes from the very same word in Turkish, the fish, kefal, which comes from kefali in Greek, the head. So autocephaly is something like self-headed. Let us name it independent. So the structure of the Orthodox Church differs radically from that of the Catholic Church, which is a vertical hierarchy, at the apex of which is the Supreme Pontiff, the Pope, seated in Rome. When in Orthodoxy, there's a horizontal organization of autocephalous churches that are legally and administratively independent, but they are united by a common faith and mutual recognition. At the Byzantine area, there was a pentarchy, the organization of the 5 patriarchates, namely Rome. Well, there was one single empire, Rome, Constantinople, Istanbul, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Well, the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople enjoyed primacy in this context by virtue of the Article 28 of the Council of Chalcedon of 451. Chalcedon is the current Kadıköy. Most of the main events of the Catholic, Orthodox Church took place in Turkey. Well, from the end of the Middle Ages, the traditional Orthodox patriarchates were joined by autocephalous churches created within the Byzantine Commonwealth. There is a concept of Byzantine Commonwealth. So there are the Serbian, Georgian, and Russian churches, and from the 19th century onwards, we witnessed national churches resulting from the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire, such as the Greek, Bulgarian, and Romanian churches. And today we have, since the 20th century, other Orthodox churches, autocephalous Orthodox churches, such as those in Albania, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and America. And you have some other churches, such as the ROKOR, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, which recently kind of merged with the Moscow Patriarchate. That's complicated. Yes.
Thank you for your answer. And my second, so to my understanding, Orthodox churches has a horizontal structure in opposition to Catholics having a vertical hierarchy.
Yes.
So my second question is about Turkey's position in this Orthodox geopolitics. Very interesting topic.
Yeah. Well, with the crisis of the churches, which occurred in 2018, well, the crisis was that the Ukrainian church declared its autocephaly. But to have such autocephaly, it asked the ecumenical patriarchate located here in Istanbul or Constantinople in the Orthodox tradition to grant what is being called the tomos, which is a decree allowing the Ukrainian church, which is headed by the Kiev metropolitan, while the metropolitan is something like an archbishop but slightly superior, let's say. It's not a patriarch, but is the metropolitan. So both political authorities and religious authorities asked the patriarch to grant them the autocephaly. And the patriarch Bartholomew said he has a doctorate in canon law from Rome in Catholic institutions. This is unique in the Orthodox world. The patriarch has a PhD in canon law, and he said, well, we granted, we allowed the Kiev Church to join Moscow at the end of 17th century. So this was a unilateral permission. Now we can withdraw it. So we just decide to withdraw it and grant Kiev autocephaly. So, well, it happens that the ecumenical patriarchate is located in Turkish soil, and the Patriarch Bartholomew is a Turkish national who performed his military service in the Turkish army. And his memoirs, he talks about this with much pride. So the issue is very complicated because successive Turkish governments of all political tendencies have always regarded the ecumenical patriarchate as a nuisance or worse, a domestic threat, and have never appreciated its international activities. In the Ukrainian case, however, Ankara seems to be giving the Patriarch Bartholomew plenty of room of maneuver. Even though officially Turkey has no specific position on the autocephaly of the Ukrainian church, it can be said that the Turkish authorities are letting it happen, which can also be interpreted as taking a position. Doing nothing, maybe taking position. So it cannot be claimed that the Turkish government is unaware or was unaware of the comings and goings of numerous Ukrainian delegations, both prelates and civil political authorities in Istanbul, despite the fact that the seat of the Patriarchate is one of the most closely watched and protected places in the city. So in this context, the church conflict, the most unexpected player is probably Turkey, a predominantly Muslim country. Because of its history and its geopolitical position, willy-nilly, Turkey became a player in the geopolitics of Orthodoxy. As the host country of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, a key player in this controversy. Even if the absence of a position is also a position, given the history of the more than tormented relations between Ankara and the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the Turkish government preferred not to choose sides in this conflict between the prelates. Also for the simple reason that too clear a position would have poisoned its relations either with the West and Ukraine or with Russia. Once it has entered the game of Orthodox geopolitics, Ankara will very probably stay there, particularly given the regional and international context at the time, even if it remains difficult to predict how the events will unfold. For the moment, Turkey is continuing its diplomacy of acrobacy, or tightrope walking, if you like, on all the dimensions of the conflict in Ukraine, including the religious dimension, following the good old method of the sublime port, which has proved its worth so many times in history.
Thank you, Professor Öktem. May I ask you,
please,
if Putin finds a metaphysical justification from patriarchate in Moscow for his convention, for his declaration of war against Ukraine, like Bush does?
Yes. Well, the religious dimension of the war is often forgotten or neglected, but for the Russian policy, the war in Ukraine is not just a physical war. It's a metaphysical war. It's also a metaphysical war because Ukraine represents the evil forces of the West. Ukraine is supposed to be a Russian land by tradition, so Moscow's mission is to get back this land and to re-Christianize it and to save it from the hands of the evil Western forces. For the Ukrainian authorities, the autocephaly of the Church of Ukraine is a new attribute of independence, and it's a step of the nation-state building process. So for both states, the war has a religious and metaphysical dimension, obviously.
Thank you, Professor Öktem. And thank you all. I want to thank all the guests for sharing their thoughts. And I would like to open this up for a brief exchange. And if you have any questions to our guests, let's start with Hugh, please.
Hello again. I formally apologize to ask too much, okay? Sorry. First, I would like to comment on Dr. Köse's nothing is new on the Western Front part. And I will give two anecdotes and then I will ask question for Dr. Köse and Dr. Bruckner. So the first is, I remember the time that Fukushima happened and Chancellor Merkel's comment on how dangerous the nuclear reactors are, and they say that, okay, nuclear reactors are the one that we have to, get out of, and it's dangerous, it's not green, etc. And then the Ukraine crisis happened. All of a sudden, the nuclear reactors become green and safe energy production mechanism. So this is the one anecdote. And the second one is about German national stereotypical values. I concur this from my own personal works, but you can find it from the Open World Value Survey answers that the Germans doesn't like to get a fight for their country. So, I can show it statistically at least, okay? So, and I know that the German army would like to extend their manpower to about 200,000. So my question is to Dr. Bruckner is that, so it will be really hard to extend this manpower to 200,000, but this is a necessity, as your officers are saying. And would there be a situation with the, you're taking the nurses, doctors, and other professionals from Turkey, and would there be the case that there will be a place for the Turkish army officers, because we have lots of them and they don't do military service anymore, and or alternatively, that the Turkey has lots of negative points in that sense in the relation between Germany and Turkey, as Dr. Köse well put it, sidelined because of the political choices. Would it be a case that in order to create this military capacity, Turkey become attractive and beautiful again, although there's an issue between Greece and Turkey and Cyprus? So my question to Dr. Bruckner is this, and I will ask to Dr. Köse, if there is, how should I say, being attractive again from the German side, do you think that the Turkish government would accept this to go on the track for the European Union membership, or would it be instrumentalize this for other political ambitions? Thank you very much.
So let me summarize your questions. I think it has been a long one. So your question to Dr. Bruckner, as I have understood, is Germans don't want to fight for their country, and they have so many reasons for this. So you are asking why they don't want to fight for their country? Your second question is about Germany's hiring Turkish military officers. Mm-hmm.
Good relations with Turkey.
Yes, please.
Thank you for the question. I like handheld microphones better, and that's why I asked for this, and now we improvise a bit. Thank you for the question. I am a perfect product of a German who wouldn't really want to fight, although I served on a German tank when I was forced to. But for half a century, we were told that war is not an option. So having the history of my country, everybody believed that no one wants to see Germans in uniform outside Germany ever again. So it was a major step when in '97, Germany under a green government joined NATO to bomb Serbia. And when I talked to my Serbian friends, it also triggered a lot of emotions that we were part of this. So it's one thing to make an announcement. It's a bit like what you said about the strategic autonomy. You can make bold statements, but to let it happen on the ground is extremely complicated if you are a liberal society in which you ask the people for permission and you don't just do it. as in countries in which you centralize power and then it's a single decision by the autocratic leader or by the king or whoever takes the decision. So therefore you have to win the hearts and minds. And if for 50 years people, or even more than 50 years, people thought that war is not an option, and since the end of the Cold War we believe that the peace dividend, like now the whole world will be a peaceful place because wars are so 20th century, to learn it the hard way overnight is for a generation of Gen Z that has other problems than thinking about would I die for my country. This is a major problem. So
and
that
Professor
explains that explains why people appear in the polls as you see. And the consequence of this is Turkey becoming beautiful again. I think Turkey has been beautiful all the time. We love Turkey and we would love to see more close relationship with Turkey, but it doesn't make it easy given the different directions in which we are heading. We had a conversation over lunch about Turkey's membership possibilities, and my answer was it takes two to tango. So it's one thing that we wish to expand further east, and on the other hand, you have to deliver and to fulfill the Copenhagen criteria. And I don't really see much moving in that direction. And what we heard in the morning simply underlines the fact that this is interesting, strategically speaking, but there is no commitment that the transformation of Turkey into a member of the European Union as a modernization strategy, if you can go in other directions, is an attractive option for where it currently stands.
And wasn't it the slogan of Konrad Adenauer's political campaign? He said no more experimentation, meaning no more expansion, no more military aggression. I think Germany is following that trend since those days. Am I correct, Professor Bruckner?
Yeah, but I don't think that history teaches us much. Like I often get this, did Jean Monnet have in mind this and that when they came up with the idea of an integrated Europe? They couldn't foresee this. Every generation reinvents what this integration project is about. Whether we deepen, whether we leave, whether we strategically position ourselves differently, but it's always an incremental process and never really a revolution, and therefore neither the strategic autonomy nor the crossroad is a proper description of what is currently happening in the capitals and in the institutions of the European Union.
I think the second question was to Professor Köse, and he asked about Turkey's direction to EU's membership, if there is a renewed attempt on this way.
Well, I mean, there is no willingness from EU side on this track, and also this is not a new phenomenon, by the way. I mean, since 2007, while Turkey was in line with Copenhagen criteria and very much willing to change constitution and make some reforms, the European politicians were bringing this issue as part of their identity politics and tried to sideline Turkey as a country outside of their definition of ideal citizen and individual. So I think it's not about the other criteria. I mean, there is no willingness in the side of Europe to accept Turkey. But according to our strategic priorities, EU membership is still our one of the priorities in Turkey's strategic agenda. So still, our president in 2025 also mentions EU membership as Turkey's strategic priority. However, becoming attractive to Germany is not one of our strategic priorities, and I think in that regard there should be improved relations in both countries, and we have some painful relations in the past. I mean, in no sensitive domain when Turkey was vulnerable, we have experienced German support in the last decade. So I think that's also some negative memories from both sides, but we have also so much of joint interest. So I think, having too much emotional definitions are not helpful, or having too much ideological definitions are also not too, helpful in this regard. I think we, Turkey and also EU and Turkey and Germany, needs to be a little bit more pragmatic and try to engage when it serves to their interests, and there is no possibility for the moment to move forward in the direction of membership because of the EU barriers. So I think under these circumstances, we can achieve lots of things. It's not a barrier to cooperation, but for membership issues, another debate. So I still feel that there is huge elements of cooperation working together towards the European security. So one thing that is clear is Turkey will be very much interested to become part of European security architecture. This is not something related to EU. So in any case, in any scenario, this will be also another priority of Turkey.
Yes, Turkey recently joined Sky Shield system and air defense system, and also Turkey is part of EU-led mineral security platform. So we are improving our collaboration with the EU, even if it is not an EU membership as an umbrella concept. So next question is from Professor Aydın.
I have two questions. First question is about the title of the session. It's about strategic autonomy, or reinforcing the Western alliance under the US hegemony. So when we titled this session, and we discussed a lot with the Professor Murat Yeşiltaş, whether to use US hegemony for the Western alliance and in relation with the Europe. And I remember the book of Ranajit Guha, the Indian historian, post-colonial historian perspective, and he also mentioned about hegemony, and he says that there is a dominance, and there wasn't hegemony in world history. And I remembered a couple of years ago, in the first term of the Trump and in the Munich Security Conference, and the reaction, the speech of the Trump and the reactions from the German side was quite interesting. So I do want to ask this question to both Uli and Hugh, Mr. Uli and Mr. Hugh, about the concept of hegemony, US hegemony, in relation with the Europe. What do you think about that, and what would be the next step for the US foreign policy in relation with Europe regarding the security developments? And my second question is for the Professor Akif Emre, because the Vladimir Medinsky is the head of the Russian diplomats in Turkey to meet with the Ukrainians, and he is also chairman of the Interdepartmental on Historical Education of Russia. And he always mentioned highlights about the Orthodox history of Russia, and it seems that it is a part of the diplomacy as well, as you highlighted here. So what would be let's say that how it is going to trigger world politics as well? What is your perspective about that? Thank you.
Yes, starting with Professor Lovatt, I think you posed your question to Professor Lovatt, right? Professor, both? Who wants to go first?
So I can do that. So in terms of the future of Europe relations with the US, and like obviously no one is saying Europe needs to sever its relations with the US. I don't think that's what strategic autonomy is about. But to the extent to which the US has a US first foreign policy these days, Europe needs a European first foreign policy. And I would say that also applies in terms of how we relate to other actors, as I talked about, including Israel. I'd say, secondly, Europe, when you speak to American officials, at least from the first Trump administration and the Democratic administrations, there's also a contradictory impulse, which I think we need to acknowledge. On one hand, there is a desire for Europe to do more, to actually to be less reliant on the US. But then when Europe does do more, and sometimes on occasion acts independently of the US, then the American officials get very angry. So there's also mixed signals from Washington in terms of what European strategic autonomy looks like. And this is, again, something as a concept the US is not that keen on. But I think certainly when it comes to cooperating with the US, Europe needs to be seen to be bringing something to the table of added value. That's not just diplomacy, that's not just economics, that's also security. And in the context where, at least theoretically, the US is pulling out of the Middle East, that hasn't happened, but at least in that theoretical concept which the Americans talk about relentlessly and the Trump administration talks about relentlessly, there's a clear need for Europe to work with other partners in the Middle East to be able to step up and fill that gap, that vacuum, especially when it comes to security, as I said. So in the Red Sea and Straits of Hormuz, what can Europe do to actually start to bring in some additional military assets, not to confront Iran or anything like that, but to help sort of provide to support a regional, a jointly owned regional security architecture in partnership with regional countries. To me, that's sort of the future of strategic autonomy to a certain extent. The final point, though, is this is also about multipolarity. And Europe still, despite its rhetoric, behaves as if this is still a moment of US hegemony. And I'm not saying the US is not the most powerful actor still in the world, it clearly is. But it is not the hegemonic actor that it used to be. And so Europe will also need to shift its behavior and its engagement as a consequence of not just the US's relative disengagement, especially from the Middle East, but also in response to this emerging multipolarity. And so it goes back to what I said, yes, we need to work with the Americans, but we also need to be able to do more to work with Turkey, to work with Saudi Arabia and other partners. And again, as with the US, that ultimately means not just words, but it also means Europe actually acting in support of common interests.
Germany felt quite comfortable in its role of assuming that dependencies are not a problem. Cheap energy from Russia, cheap security from the United States, and cheap things that we don't want to manufacture anymore from China was seen as an integral part of our business model. And then everything fell apart within a short period of time, and you need to recalibrate. And this is happening in a time in which the political elite in Germany that has been socialized in the belief that all of this is something that you can take for granted, elects a 70-year-old, Friedrich Merz is turning 70 in a few weeks, who spent most of his professional life in an American working environment. He served as a politician, as the speaker of the most important old boys network called Atlantikbrücke, the bridge to cross the Atlantic, in which you exchange geostrategic thoughts and make business connections. And he worked for a law firm, an American one, and he worked for BlackRock. And only when Merkel came to the conclusion that 4 terms is enough, he saw the chance that his trauma of losing against Merkel could allow him to continue and restore the world that he knew best. And this is not the world in which we live in. So I think on the one hand, we have the most committed transatlanticist in the Chancellery, and on the other hand, I have my doubts if he fully understands what's going on. And he can positively surprise me. While we speak, he's at the G7 summit and the world is watching how he will perform. Same thing next week. And Germans are already praising him that he wasn't bullied in the White House when he first visited the United States. This is the very low standard that we currently observe for, is a German chancellor performing well? And I'm only talking about the person. And our constitution decentralized power to a degree that everything that was said about, and at the end of the day, one human decides. This doesn't really apply to Germany, because we come a long way from a totalitarian system to personalize all the power in Hitler, and therefore the constitution decentralizes it, and the whole world and media assumes that the German chancellor is as powerful as the Chinese president or the US president or the Turkish president. We don't have a president, nor do we have a king. So that makes it extremely complicated in a very sophisticated system of checks and balances to expect leadership in a similar sense. On top of it, everything I just said about the socialization as a country that sees war not as an option makes it extremely complicated for whoever serves in that position to guide the country into something that sounds like strategic autonomy or formulates a different relationship with the United States. And on top of it, everything we hear from the White House sounds so the opposite of what we would like to hear in this wishful thinking of we would love to accept American hegemony as long as they do what we want. And now they don't do us the favor and we feel kind of lost. This is the general sentiment, and I don't think that Friedrich Merz will make much of a difference.
Thank you, Professor Bruckner. As Mr. Lovatt says, the US is not the hegemon it used to be anymore, so the EU has to expand its partnerships with alternative partners, including Turkey. But how about our long, tiring, and sometimes heartbreaking membership process? I think Turkey is expected to show some political maturity on this. And if I think we have one last question, and then we will leave it here after answering your question. Yes, please, go ahead. I'm sorry, so you also had a question to answer?
Yeah, I received the questions from
I'm really sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
May I? Yeah.
Yes, please, go
Very
ahead.
shortly, well, what will happen with the church's crisis and Ukrainian war? Whoever wins the war will win the church conflict too. I mean, let me start by this observation. In the Orthodox tradition, there is the so-called symphony of the powers between the state and the church. So symphony is exactly the same word as in music, symphonia. The voices are going together. There is a unanimity or unison of voices. So church and state are intermingled. This is valid for any kind of state. This is valid for the Ottoman tradition as well. I mean, the Greek Patriarchate was part of the Ottoman state apparatus, and in excellent relations with the Sublime Porte. This is another issue. But coming back to Russia, well, in Russia, today's structure, the relationship between the church and the state, well, it's exactly the same as it was established under Peter the Great, that we Turks, we call Peter the Crazy, but the rest of the world call him Peter the Great. So Peter the Great made of the church a public office. So this was the case under the Russian Empire. This was the case under communist administration. Yes, because the communist administration instrumentalized they killed the half, the other half, they instrumentalized them, and this is the case today. So the church is part of the state, and His Holiness, the Patriarch of Moscow, Cyril, gets his salary from Mr. Putin. So this is an instrument of the policy, and especially of foreign policy. So if Russia wins the war and, who knows, invades Kiev, there will be no more any longer any autocephalous Ukrainian church, or we will have, as it occurred subsequent to the Russian Revolution, there will be an Orthodox independent church in exile. But I don't know what will happen, because you know that in Kiev there are two Orthodox churches: the autocephalous churches of Ukraine, and another church which is dependent from Moscow and which rejected the declaration of autocephaly. There used to be more churches in Kiev. Today, to my knowledge, there are only two left, and one of the churches is still dependent from Moscow. Fourth observation, Turkey is necessarily an actor of the game. Let me simply remind that the whole struggle between the Ottoman Empire and Russia starts with the Treaty of Küçük Kaynarca of 1774, which grants, according to a common place, which grants to Russia a right of protection over Ottoman Orthodox subjects. The entire 19th century evolves with this debate over the right to protection of Russia over the Orthodox subjects. All the wars between the Sublime Porte and St. Petersburg were triggered by this issue. Please have a look on the Treaty of Küçük Kaynarca. There is no mention of Russian protectorates. So this is a beautiful how can I say, trick of the Russian diplomacy. If there is a protection over the Orthodox subjects of the Ottoman Empire, it's not by the Russian government, it's by another government, which is specifically precised in the treaty. It's the Ottoman government, which is granted protection over the Orthodox subjects. So everything depends on the end of the war, but anyway, Russia will continue to instrumentalize the church in order to control first Ukraine and possibly other countries. Next.
Thank you, Professor Öktem. I will add one last thing over here. Ukraine, as I remember, was militarily neutral, and this was embedded in Ukrainian constitution. Only with the Russian annexation of Crimea, they wanted to join NATO. I think this has a similar. This is a similar thing. Ukrainian church was not independent, but then they declared their autocephaly, and I think it was the Ukraine war that set things off. Am I correct?
Well, the declaration of autocephaly was prior to the war. It was one of the factors that accelerated or worsened the relations between Russia and Ukraine, obviously. But we cannot say that it was only the autocephaly issue that triggered the war, but it was part of the tension, the increasing tension.
Yes, thank you for your contributions. I think it has been a rich discussion, and we have to leave it here because we are out of time. And thank you for participating. So, okay then. If you have time, we can have another last question. I depend on you. Right, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Professor. And I'm a master student from Hacettepe University, and I just want to ask Professor Köse and Professor Lovatt a very small question. What do you think of the future Turkey and EU relations after the statements from Öcalan and the ceasefire statements of PKK? And do you think the statements really make sense, especially for the PKK branches like in Syria and in Iran? Thanks.
I think this is forwarded to Professor Köse, I guess, a little bit.
I don't find it quite relevant for EU-Turkey relations. Of course,
out of scope question.
It would reduce burden on Turkey to deal with the terrorism threat. So if this issue has been handled peacefully through, dissolution of PKK, though this will securitize Turkey's borders, and also we have a significant presence of PKK network in Europe, so we hope that those networks also dissolve and turn to legal activities. So this will reduce some of the pressure, and especially many of the European capitals are unhappy about Turkey's struggle against PKK terrorism. So this may also reduce the tension, but regardless of the European position, this is a fundamental national security issue for Turkey. So we will continue to deal with the PKK in a security manner. But if this security issue is handled, this will reduce some of those tensions. So, yeah.
So thank you for these last words. And I really can't end it up today. So please.
I'm sorry, it's a small question. My name is Murat Tüleker, Dr. Murat Tüleker. I have a question for Professor Öktem. It was very interesting, but why do you constantly refer to Patriarchate of Constantinople as ecumenical? Because the reason I ask that is the Patriarch of Constantinople is mentioned only mentioned in first place in prayers, not the political and etc. The Serbian or Georgian Orthodox Church do not recognize it as an ecumenical. Thank you.
The ethnicity of the Patriarchate is a matter of canon law. And from, I'm not expert on canon law, but the first councils say that the Patriarchate of Constantinople has the universal power, and it is generally in these terms that it is being mentioned in the ancient texts, including the Ottoman ones. You will find the term Cihan Şumul or things similar in Ottoman documents. From a, let's say, secular viewpoint, to the best of my knowledge, there is no Turkish legislation prohibiting the use of the term ecumenical. And if I remember correctly, there has been plenty of crises in the past 20 years about the use of the term, but recently I think that Turkish government freely uses the term ecumenical in the exchanges of documents or friendly communications, congratulations for the religious feast and everything. I think the crisis is over, and there is no prohibition for the term.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to the contributors.